Greetings everyone, this is Ehav Ever, and I'm going to be talking today about Israeli national identity. So in order to understand this topic that I'm going to be talking about, there's a number of original Hebrew terms that are needed to really get a good grasp of what I'm going to say. The first one is Ivrim or Ivri. This is how we say in the Middle East, Hebrew or Hebrews. The next word is Yisrael, Yisraelim. This is how we say in Hebrew, Israel, Israelites, or Israelis. The next term is Yehudim or Yehudi, which is how we say Jews or Jew. So, this is basically plural and singular words that I'm giving you. And then the next one is Ivrit, which is how we pronounce the Hebrew language. The last term being Goim or Goy, which is a nation, a group of people. So you may wonder why these terms are important, the ones that I just mentioned. If you look at this slide here, it kind of gives you a history of the terminology that's been used within the Israelite/Israeli community /Jewish community concerning who we are. These terms are biblical terms as well as local terms and historical terms. This is extremely important when we start talking about the particular elements of what makes up the Israeli national identity, what has in the past made up the identity, what over time made up the identity, and how that affects us currently in terms of who is a Jew, who is an Israeli, and how did those identities come about. So let's start with the ancient sources. When we look at this map here, we're looking at an area of where were the initial wanderings/travels, adventures, if you will, of the Ivrim, which were the people I mentioned before, the Hebrew people. These people could have, were basically found throughout different parts of the Middle East in terms of Mesopotamia and Arabia. When we look at wall paintings in Egypt, we get an idea of what kind of people the Ivrim were, because they were Semitic people along with other ethnic groups that were in the region. So it wasn't just that, when we say Semitic, that it means just the Jewish people, but, their ancestors were Ivrim, and Ivrim were made up of a number of different types of ethnic groups. The slide we're looking at now gives us a breakdown of how this originally started. We see that Abraham, who was the son of Terach, had a number of different descendants who also had descendants that were still connected to the Israelite people. So the beginning of the Israeli identity began with several major events, the first being the Exodus from Egypt, which is mentioned in the Bible, as well as the gathering at Mount Sinai, or Har Sinai as we say in Hebrew, which culminated in basically the belief that God gave the Torah to the people that were there. Now, what's interesting about this event is this is what we first begin to see starts the idea and the concept of having an Israeli identity. We see that there was a central place that, was basically a gathering place of the faith of Israel, as well as a destination, an eventual destination that would lead to the reclaiming of the land that Abraham had once owned, which was in the land of Canaan, which eventually became known as Yisrael. Yisrael initially was made up of 12 different tribal federations, but over time, that initial tribal federations formed themselves into a national unit. And when that national unit was formed, what we eventually see is the building of a temple that was in Jerusalem, which is the central place, the holiest site of all of the Israelite faith, the Israeli faith, as well as the, over time, the centrality of the Yehudi faith, So when we start talking about defining who were the various peoples or ethnic groups within this Israeli national identity, within this Israeli nationalist, if you will, movement, we have to go to the Torah, which are the 5 books of Moses, because this gives us the definitions of who made up this society. When we start looking at what these terminologies were, there are 4 basic overall terminologies which have, of course, subcurrents within them that we have to look at. The first group were the Kohanim. They were Israelite priests who were descended from Aaron, the brother of Moses, who was of the tribe of Levi. The Lewiim, who were the Israelite priests who were not descended from Aaron, but were also descendants of the tribe of Levi. The Israelim from the non-priestly tribes, which were 11 tribes, and Geirim, who were non-Israelites who converted to the Israelite faith. Now, when we start looking at the biblical text, we see that along with the Israelites, a multitude of people who made up the lower castes of the Egyptian society left with them. So what this means is that these people would have been Geirim. So over time, the Israelite society, the Israeli society, would have been made up of a mixture of people who eventually became one group of people in a national setting. So we don't use, like, the pictures you're looking at now are not being used to say that this is exactly what the Israelim look like. This is just to give you an idea from Middle Eastern / African sources what the various groups of people who would have made up the Israeli society may have looked like during that time, as well as the people who would have joined them, because once again they were Geirim, non-Israelites who joined into the society. So let me now give an example of what I mean by this concept of Geirim and Yisraelim being one society. So let's look at one good example, one that is close to home for me. There was a point in time where you had early Semitic people who were crossing in from Arabia, from the Middle East into Africa. So let's take an example of a group of Yisraelim or Yehudim, depending on what time frame you go by, who crossed from, let's say Yemen into West Africa. Let's say, as an example with this picture here, you have a Yemenite Yehudi who came across and then marries, for example, a West African woman who converts, who is a Georet, basically is a woman who converts to the Israelite faith. They start marrying and they have children. Okay, let's say you also have another Yehudi or Yisraeli, who comes across and marries two different wives. One, that you see in the top picture, which is an example, Shadeh, was from West Africa, and one who's more of an Indian. So then he has children from both of these wives. Okay, so let's give the third example of a Yisraelite woman, or a Yehudit woman who marries a West African man, from from the western part of West Africa. This man being a Ger, someone who becomes part of the Israelite faith, and then they start having children. In situations like this, as you can see, you start to build up a community of people, a community of Yehudim or Yisraelim who are in a new location. They start to, form communities, they start to form synagogues, and over time, they have descendants, and their descendants are now a mix of those groups. So what this eventually created was basically a society of people who, when Israel was reformed, now were made up of a number of different ethnicities, still remaining and still maintaining that Israeli component, because of course that would have been, for many communities, the majority. But over time, they became known based upon the locations where they went, and they, took on certain cultural elements from those locations. So this begins to give us the variances that you now see in modern Israeli society between various groups. You see that there were Yisraelim or Yehudim who traveled to various parts of the Middle East and had descendants that now look like any indigenous person in the Middle East, just as the Yisraelim were indigenous to the Middle East. And just as our ancestors were, we are also. You also had a number of Yisraelim who went into Asia and either married or converted people in those regions, and over time those people formed their own communities, and you had variances of culture. The same thing in southern Arabia. You had people who joined those communities, and in some cases you had whole entire groups of Yisraeli communities who basically made up the entire population of the Yehudim or the Yisraelim. So in using English terms, this is like saying in many cases you had situations where various Israelites or Jews went to regions, formed their own communities, and then were insular communities, because of the various situations. This is especially true after the rise of anti-Semitism from both Christian and Islamic sources. You also had Jews, Yisraelim and Yehudim, who made their ways into northern Africa, and in some cases either formed insular communities or married people from the local population. And with this, you start to have an increase and a growth in the amount of Yisraelim and Yehudim. And this is also why you start to see Yisraelim and Yehudim who, over time, their descendants start to have, various differences in the way they look. So when Yisraelim and Yehudim went north into Europe, some of them married Europeans, many of them didn't. And, over time, they began to have descendants who start to look like other Europeans. The same thing when you had Yisraelim or Yehudim who went into Ethiopia, into East Africa. They, eventually converted or married those people there, and yet the same thing. And then you also have in the land of Israel a group of Yisraelim who split off from the original faith and became what's now known as the Samaritans. So this is a short, in a nutshell, concept of Israelite, Yisraeli, basically ethnicity.